This happened just last year when I was 32. I had gotten married when I was 27, and it was good for the first year or two, but it was basically over after our 4th anniversary. We were little more than roommates after that. Being the guy, I was expected to move out of our house. However, after the legal costs and the bank took their part, there was not much left anyway, so my ex was out on her own soon enough as well. To add insult to injury, my company was laying people off at around that time, and I thought I was going to get fired in the next round. Because of that, I was thinking of moving back with my parents for a while, and didn't want to commit to a year lease. I didn't want to let the job go though, just in case they didn't can me, so I went for a short-term place while things were getting sorted out. Being in my 30s, I never thought I would end up in a shared house again, but that is what happened. I answered an ad on Craigslist and went to see the place. A nice older guy showed me the room, which had its own bathroom and quite a lot of space. It was $800 for the month, which was cheap for my city. I took it on the spot and handed him a bank draft for the full amount. He said I could renew on a month-to-month basis. I moved in later that week with just a suitcase full of my stuff. I had some other things in storage. On my first night, I met a couple who had recently moved to the country from Germany. They lived in the large room upstairs, while I was on the main floor. They were in their early 20s, and they seemed so enthusiastic about the future, kind of the opposite of me at the time. I was bitter and jaded, but trying to hide it from my new housemates. We had dinner together at the kitchen table. The couple made pasta and were kind enough to share with me. They told me they were moving out soon, even though they had only been in the house for a few weeks before me. I asked why, and they reluctantly told me that it was because of a fight with another of the people that lived there. They tried to be polite about it, but it was clear they were shaken. They said the man lived in the basement and was difficult to deal with. They didn't go into detail, but it was obvious that they were rattled. The German couple took off for bed early, and I went to my room by around 9 o'clock as well. A few days later, the couple was gone, and someone else had moved in already, but I just met him in passing. I didn't meet the guy in the basement until about a week later. I was in the kitchen upstairs and he walked in. At that moment, I knew that he must be the guy that the couple told me about, but I tried to pretend that they hadn't said anything. I tried to be polite and introduce myself. His name was Jim, and he was 25 years old. He was thin and had a patchy beard that looked messy, like he just didn't bother to clean it up. When we spoke, he seemed awkward, like he hadn't talked to anyone in a long time. I asked him what he did for work, but he avoided the question. After an uncomfortable 5 minutes, he went back downstairs. It was weird, but if that was all the couple was creeped out about, then I would have said they were overreacting. At that moment, I just thought he was a little weird, but it got much worse. The following week was fairly normal. It was boring at work, but I was happy that I still had a job. I tried to settle into my new routine, and kept mostly to myself. The house was quiet, and I didn't see much of the other people, because I stayed in my room most of the time. Then one night, everything changed. I was sitting in my room, reading a book, when I heard a knock at my bedroom door. I wasn't going to answer it, but then I heard a voice saying that it was the police. I walked over to the door, and opened it just enough to see who was there. Sure enough, there were 2 uniformed officers standing right outside my room. I hadn't even heard them come into the house. I guess I wouldn't have noticed since other people lived there. One of the police told me that they were investigating a possible robbery. I soon found out that Jim had accused me. I was obviously shocked, because I would never do that. I had barely spoken to the guy, let alone stolen anything from him. The officers asked if they could search my room. I agreed out of instinct, even though I know now that it is better to refuse. At the time, I was thinking it would make me look guilty not to let them, but they can't use that against you anyway. Regardless, I let them check, thinking that I had nothing to hide. To my shock, they found Jim's wallet and a few other items in my closet. I couldn't believe it. I knew he must have planted them there. After the police left, I was furious and scared. I had no idea what that guy was up to. Against my better judgment, I decided to confront him the next day. When I went to the basement, he wasn't there. His room was locked, and I could hear faint music playing from inside. I knew that he left it playing pretty much all the time, even when he wasn't home. I banged on the door anyway, but there was no answer. I went back to my room and locked my door, feeling worried about what might happen next. Over the next few days, I avoided Jim and tried to stay out of the house as much as possible. I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. One night, I woke up to a noise. It was past midnight, and the house was silent, except for the sound coming from my door. I realized someone was trying to break into my room. I quietly got out of bed and grabbed a heavy book to use as a weapon, because I couldn't find anything better. I went to the door and pressed my ear against it. There was definitely someone fiddling with the lock. I flung the door open, and sure enough, it was him. Jim jumped back, clearly startled. He tried to play dumb and made some nonsense excuse, but we both knew that he was trying to get into my room, probably to plant evidence for his next scam. I told him to get out and never come near my room again. He mumbled an apology and went downstairs. I locked the door and stayed awake for a while, listening for any more signs of him. The next morning, I called the landlord and explained what happened, but he seemed indifferent, saying there was little he could do. I began looking for a new place to live, checking ads online and asking around at work. A few days later, I was sitting in the living room when Jim came upstairs. He tried to act like nothing had happened, but I ignored him. He hovered for a moment, then went to the kitchen. Right then, I took the opportunity to leave the house. I returned later that evening to find Jim waiting for me in the hallway. He looked more disheveled than usual, and his eyes were bloodshot. It didn't take long before he started screaming at me. He accused me of trying to turn everyone in the house against him. I tried to ignore him and get to my room, but I had to walk right by him. As soon as I was close, he lunged at me and grabbed me by the back of my neck. I dodged and managed to push him away, then ran to my room and locked the door. I called the police, reporting the assault. There wasn't anybody else there at the time, though, so I didn't have any witnesses. However, when the police came, he admitted to what he did, or at least enough of it for them to arrest him. This time, the cops took Jim into custody. He wasn't at the house again for at least a week, because that was when I moved out. I had only paid for 1 month up front, so when that was up, I simply found another place. Luckily, I was never fired from my job, and I ended up getting a decent apartment a few months later. Hopefully, I'll never have to live with roommates again. To start off, I am a 27-year-old guy. I graduated from college a few years ago, but this happened in my first year when I lived on campus. For those that don't know how it works, you apply for a spot in residence, and they automatically match you up with a roommate. You fill out a little form, so they can try to match you up with someone compatible, but I suspect that it is more or less random. I actually went as a mature student, since I took a few years off to save up money, so I was 21 in my first year. That might have been the only thing that they actually considered. My roommate was named Danny, and he was a punk rocker type of guy with spiked hair, and he always wore band t-shirts. He was also older like me. I think he was 22. He checked in before me, so he got the bed that was farther away from the door. When I walked in, he got up and we shook hands. He seemed nice, but after talking for a while, it seemed that we didn't have much in common. I was into reading and playing video games, while Danny was more about loud music and partying. One thing that really bothered me was that he smoked cigarettes, and the smell lingered in our room. I could tell that as soon as I walked in. The building had a no smoking policy, of course, but it came in on his clothes for sure. It wasn't something we fought about, but it did create some tension between us. We didn't hang out much together. I had made some friends on our floor, but Danny mostly kept to himself. It was about a month in, and most nights on the weekend, he would go out to party off campus, probably hitting some punk shows or something. All I really knew was that he would go out early and come back late, or sometimes not at all. If I had to guess, he only slept in our room about half the time, which I didn't mind since I had more space. He hadn't made any friends in the dorm, but he started hanging out with some guys who didn't go to our school. These guys looked like other punk rockers who we probably met at a concert or something. They would come around occasionally, but usually didn't stay long. One evening, however, I walked into our room to find 4 or 5 of these older guys hanging out, drinking beer, and one of them was even smoking a cigarette, although blowing it out the window. They were probably in their 30s, or maybe older. I said hi, and tried to hide how uncomfortable I was, but after less than 5 minutes, I went to one of my friend's rooms and stayed there until it was late. When I went back to my room that night at around 1, they were gone, and Danny didn't come back that day. The next night, however, he came in at 10 in the evening. We didn't talk much because I was on my computer studying. I did get a look at him though, and it seemed like he hadn't slept at all. If I had to guess, he was heavily into drinking and drugs. Actually, it was pretty obvious that he was. As time went on, Danny's new friends started coming around more often. I didn't understand why he was hanging out with these older guys, and I tried to avoid them as much as possible, spending more time in the library or with my friends on the floor. One time, Danny got a warning for bringing them into the dorm, and he had also been warned for smoking in the building. It was starting to seem like he might get kicked out. Horrible as it seems, I was kind of hoping he would. Not that I hated him or anything, but it was annoying having a roommate like that. There was another night when Danny and his friends were partying in our room again. I went in and hung out for a while, but I could tell that it wasn't my scene. There were no drugs or anything, but I got a bad vibe from one of his friends. I can't remember his name, but this guy must have been 35 years old and over 300 pounds. He was bald, with a jean vest and ripped jeans. At around 10 at night, I slipped away and went to one of my friend's rooms, as I often did in situations like that. I was right next door, so I could still hear them all night. Past midnight, I could hear our RA talking to them about the noise. It was a weeknight after all. They argued for a bit, but eventually I could hear them leaving. I went back to my room after that, and after airing it out for cigarette smoke, I went to bed. I didn't see Danny the next day, or the day after. It was still kind of normal for him to disappear for a couple days, but after about a week, I started to get worried. This was getting close to exams for the first semester of the year, so we had been roommates for a few months at the time. I asked around the dorm, but no one had seen him. I even tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I sent more than a few messages, but got no response. Eventually, I decided it was time to report him missing. I went to the campus security office and told them about Danny. I left the office feeling a bit guilty for not reporting it sooner, but I hoped Danny would just turn up soon with a reasonable explanation. After reporting it, campus security interviewed me a couple of times, asking about friends and the guys he'd been hanging out with. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. His friends on campus were scarce, and those older guys were a mystery. I never got to know them very well, and didn't even have a way to contact them at all. One night, I was in the common room with some friends when we saw a police car pull up outside the dorm from the window. A couple of officers came in and headed straight for the RA's room. I had a feeling this was about Danny. Later, the RA came to my room with the police officers. They asked me the same questions that campus security had. It was all just about the last time I saw him and who he was with. I repeated my answers, but the cops seemed to be interrogating me. It was like they didn't believe me or something, like I was holding something back. I guess they thought it was weird that I didn't know who my roommate's friends were. The officers left after a while, and we all started talking about it more. Some people thought he had run away. Others thought something horrible might have happened to him. No one really knew anything for sure, though. A couple of weeks went by with no word from Danny. The police stopped by a few more times, but never talked to me again. I guess I was ruled out somehow. The police believed Danny had been involved in something with those older guys. They did track them down eventually, but they didn't help. In my opinion, one or multiple of them must have had something to do with the disappearance. Whether it was an accident or otherwise, I am not sure, but they must know. We never got any answers though, and the year went by without my roommate. This is a scary story about a guy I used to know. We were kind of friends for a few years prior to this happening, but we weren't very close. I was in university, and I would see him around at parties sometimes. His name was Nick, and we always had a good time whenever he was around. I guess I felt like we were pretty good friends for a while, but we never really hung out other than that. I had a house with 3 friends back then. We rented the whole thing and split the rent evenly. With 4 of us, that was only $350 each, so pretty cheap. That's in $2006 though, so not quite the crazy deal that it might sound like now. It was an older house that was in rough shape. The floors were creaky and always dirty, even after we cleaned. It was so bad that we all wore shoes inside most of the time. It was not too far from campus, so it was a good place for us as students. One night, I was out at a bar with 2 of my roommates and another friend. We saw Nick there, and he pulled up a chair to our table. After talking for a while, he mentioned that he needed a place to stay. He was living in an apartment by himself at the time, but he couldn't afford it anymore, so he had to move out. When we left the bar that night, me and my roommate Sean were talking while we walked home. He mentioned that we had a spare room in our house that might make a decent bedroom. It was really just a large closet that was awkwardly placed next to the living room. It would have been barely big enough to fit a single bed. Sean thought it would be cool to have Nick move in though, and I agreed. After some discussion, we decided to ask him to move in. He came by to look at the room, which we had cleared out already. It looked surprisingly big when all the junk was removed. It did have a light and an electric socket, but no window. When he saw it, he agreed to take it on the spot. He probably didn't have much choice anyway. Nick moving in seemed like a good idea at first. We all saved a bit of money on rent, and having another person around seemed like it would be fun. Nick was easygoing, and we all got along pretty well. We would hang out together, watch movies, and sometimes make dinner as a group in the evenings. For a while, everything seemed to be going well. One thing to mention about him, though, was that he was a smoker, and I don't mean cigarettes. We were college kids back then, and smoking was quite popular. One of my other roommates was pretty into it as well, so it didn't seem like a huge deal, but Nick was basically always smoking. I didn't even know where he was getting the money for it all. It would have been expensive the way he was going. It was a few weeks before anything really happened. I came home one afternoon after an early morning class. When I walked up to the front door, I saw that the mail had come in. It was almost always junk mail, but sometimes there would be some coupons that I would use, so I grabbed it from the box and went into the house. I sat down at the coffee table in the living room, then spread the mail out in front of me. Shockingly, there was an envelope that was addressed to me, and it was from Capital One, the credit card company. At first, I thought it was some promotion to get me to apply for a card, but when I opened it, there was a new credit card in there with my name on it. It seemed like a mistake, so I gave them a call. After waiting on hold forever, I was able to talk to someone. They assured me that I had applied for the card, but gave me the option to cancel it. I was still confused, but canceling still seemed like the best choice. When I hung up the phone, I sat there and thought about it for a few minutes. That was the first time that I started to suspect Nick. Living in the house, he would have been able to get a copy of most of my important documents when I wasn't around. It would be pretty crappy to accuse anybody without evidence, though, so I was torn. I talked to another of my roommates, hoping that there would be something else to go on, but I was the only one who got a mystery card in the mail. Over the next few days, some things began to go missing in the house as well. Sean thought there was some money missing from his room. We all began to suspect Nick, maybe because we didn't trust him as much, and because these things happened not that long after he moved in. When Nick came home that night, we confronted him in the living room. As soon as I accused him, he got really mad and started yelling. I was sitting on the couch and he came over, standing right over me. He kept telling me to stand up, but I knew that if I did, then there would be a fight. I didn't want that, so I stayed sitting. He leaned down and grabbed me by the shirt anyway, and tried to pull me up. He almost ripped it off of me before one of the other guys pulled him back. Then I saw him turn around and throw a punch at my roommate Andrew. As soon as he did that, the rest of us got involved. We took him down to the ground and held him for a while, then eventually let him up. He didn't get violent again, and we managed to get him out the door. I was scared that he would come back and trash the house, but that night, he didn't even come back. I still don't know where he stayed, but I was happy that he wasn't there. He did have a key though, so I was still nervous. We didn't see him for the next few days, not at school and not at the house. One night, when it was late, probably 3 a.m., I was struggling to fall asleep. That was when I heard the front door open. As soon as that sound hit my ears, I knew it was Nick. It couldn't have been anybody else. Before I knew it, footsteps could be heard coming up the stairs. Then my bedroom door burst open, and Nick walked right in towards me. He came right up to my bed and grabbed me by the shoulder, then threw me to the floor. I was still conscious enough to scream for help. Within seconds, 2 of my other roommates came in to help me fight him off. They tackled him to the ground and held him down again. This time, I called the cops, something we should have done the first time. While the cops were there, I told them about the situation with the credit card. They didn't handle that stuff personally, but gave me the number for the financial crimes unit. Apparently credit card fraud is a pretty big deal, and when I called to report it, they were able to prove that it was Nick who applied. I don't know the details of that, but they were able to trace it somehow. At least with that, we had proof that it was him. That wasn't the end of it though. We still had to clean out what was left of his room. When we were emptying it out, there was a small plastic box that was kind of transparent. It was blue clear plastic. I opened it, and inside was what looked like several used needles and other drug paraphernalia. He spent some time in jail, but when he got out, he stayed away from us, and we never contacted him again. By the end of that semester, he had dropped out of school, and I think he moved away.